and great to be here. I'm Nikki Yoxall. I'm Technical Director at Pasture for Life. I also farm, based across 2 farms currently, one in Aberdeenshire and one in Angus. So we manage about 2,500 hectares now, which is slightly overwhelming. That was a big change this year. But majority of my work is around working with farmers and that straddling that space between research and kind of knowledge exchange and what's happening on farm. So I've done a fair bit of work around carbon audits. We've been undertaking a fair bit of work on this in Pasture for Life. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a kind of whistle-stop tour. And then I'm going to hand over to Jock, who will introduce himself fully when we get to his section. And he is going to talk about how carbon audits have been used in his business to support change, to give an information about what's happening in the business and some of the work that he's been doing through over the last few years, particularly thinking about emissions reductions, but also resilience and sustainability. So I'm just going to share my screen, and this worked earlier, so I'm hoping that it's going to work again. There we go. Now, I can't see you, so can you just tell me if you're seeing what I'm hoping you're seeing?
We can see cows.
Brilliant. Excellent. Cool. So, yeah, carbon audits. So before I talk about those, and most of you actually know about Pasture for Life, but just in case you don't, a very quick just opportunity to tell you a bit about what we do. So we believe grazing animals power the regeneration of landscapes, economies, food cultures and communities across the UK. And we help farmers harness the power of pasture for the benefit of the natural world, their communities and themselves. And this is one of my favourite photos, which was taken on our Scotland study tour in 2023 in the Borders. And it was a really great opportunity for a bunch of farmers to come together and see what we've all been doing. You might recognise some people in that photo. And that's the sort of stuff that we get up to. We have 1,500 members across the UK, 165 certified businesses. So that means these are farms that are producing livestock and livestock products feeding only pasture. We are one of those. Jock is one of those as well. And yeah, there are another 163 of us all across the UK, and that's across beef, sheep, but also dairy. And we also have some goat production as well included in that, and 2 venison farms as well. We have 100 events that we put on across the UK every year. And in Scotland, we also run a skills development programme or traineeship that kicks off for this year next week, and there are a couple of spaces still left on that. If anybody's interested, let me know. But our services cover all things: membership, community development, knowledge exchange, research, supply chain development, general business development, supporting farms to improve their business strategy. This is an area that we're moving into. We obviously have our certification and our standards, which I've talked about, and we are now working with Reading University to develop data insight opportunities, and we are rolling out consultancy as well as delivering the events that I've already talked about. So a lot going on within Pasture for Life. And one of the things that we often get asked about is making sense of challenges and issues that are coming up in agriculture. And the main one we get asked to talk about is carbon and the carbon cycle. So I'm sure this is something you all know, and I'm very conscious we've got actual proper scientists on the call who will know this inside out and back to front. But I do just want to make reference to the carbon cycle before we start going into talking about carbon audits and life cycle analysis. And I guess the first thing to say is that the carbon cycle, well, carbon in and of itself is not a bad thing. Carbon is the building block of life, and without it, none of us would exist. And it's just absolutely imperative that we recognise carbon for what it is, that it is not something that we need to get rid of. It's something that we need to be able to manage the cycling of. And essentially, the carbon cycle is just a way of understanding and talking about how carbon moves from different places from the atmosphere into plants, into the soil, and then how it moves back out again. And it varies through different mechanisms, whether that's grazing, photosynthesis, whether it's drilling for oil, whatever it is. But essentially, the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon through different parts of our planet, our world, and all of us are made up of carbon. So it's everywhere. It's not something we can get rid of. So when a very popular brewery bought up a piece of ground to plant a forest on it, and they had placards saying "kill carbon," it kind of missed the point, which was that, you know, without it we wouldn't exist. So that is the first point I want to make. And it is a very natural cycle. And the main way that we have disrupted and really changed this very natural cycle is predominantly through the extraction, the drilling for and extraction of fossil fuels, because that carbon pool, if you like, where the decomposed plant and animal material has been converted to oil and gas and coal over millions of years, is this very long-term storage opportunity, if you like. It's where carbon goes to be stored long term. And when we talk about long term, we're talking millions and millions of years. And our disruption of that has completely shifted the balance of the carbon cycle. So we have to recognize that in and of itself, that industrialization is the key driver of climate change. And then the ongoing disruption and the use of those fossil fuels to change and disrupt the natural carbon cycles is really what is causing an imbalance. And then we see that imbalance heightened by more intensive systems. And we'll talk a little bit about how the use of carbon dioxide, the use of fossil fuels is kind of driving some of that challenge, but also how some of the intense systems seem to come off, for want of a word, better in the way that we measure these things. And that can be quite confusing for farmers, because when you're standing in a luscious field of pasture and what you're being told is that your system is more carbon intensive than, for example, if you went and stood in an intensive total mixed ration fed dairy unit where the animals never go outside, it's very difficult for us to kind of get our heads around, or what, one feels innately more nature friendly and positive in terms of cycling and ecosystem services, and the other feels much more kind of man-made. How can one be better than the other weighted in that way? So we'll dig into that a little bit as we go through the talk this afternoon. But I think it's also important that we've got the carbon cycle, that we understand where carbon audits came from. And carbon audits were born out of something called LCA, life cycle analysis. So it has been referenced as life cycle assessment, but normally it's called life cycle analysis. And for agriculture, this evaluates the environmental impacts of farming practices from start to finish. And it was actually invented to look at industrialized systems and processes, linear processes that happen in factories. And that's where it came from. And it has been applied to all sorts of different businesses and sectors and industries now as the standard way that we measure and understand emissions. Now, one of the things about LCAs is that they're not just about carbon. You can run a social impact LCA. You can run a water quality LCA. You can run an LCA, a life cycle analysis, essentially for any sort of system or output that you want to, but then the majority of them are undertaken particularly focusing on greenhouse gas emissions. And these LCAs are essentially a linear assessment of a cyclical process. So they are very, very good at understanding linear processes. So if you've got a factory and you're taking some raw material and you're using energy to turn it into a gadget, and you're then selling that gadget at the end of your factory, LCA is really, really good at being able to understand that. They definitely struggle more with more cyclical systems. And so what happens is, if we think of our carbon cycle that I referenced a second ago as being this circle, so we've got carbon moving around between the air, between animals, between plants, and that's going round and round in a cycle. And what LCA does is whack a line through the middle of it. And then it says, we're just going to look at these 2 points here. And you can see from the diagram that, it's indicating that we're missing a massive part of the story. We're really missing kind of what's happening to different emissions in different places and how different things are driving parts of that system, and what the processes are that are going on below the line and what's happening above the line. And we're only looking really at the in and the out. And that definitely is a limitation of LCA, and therefore a limitation of carbon audits, because they operate pretty much in the same way. What I will say is that more and more carbon audits are recognizing this. So carbon audits that are operating in the commercial sphere are responding to the feedback, particularly from farmers, of lower input systems and systems that rely on that ecosystem function to drive the business forward. they're listening to that feedback that we're all saying, well, what about all the below the line stuff? And particularly in relation to the behavior of plants and soil carbon and the storage of carbon in biomass. And if we're changing our grazing management, what does that mean? And if we're planting more trees, but they're at different ages, or we've got hedges and we're cutting those, what does that mean? So carbon audit companies are doing more to try and understand the above and below the line aspects of the cycle, but they are definitely struggling because what happens is they miss the data. They just don't have the data available to fulfill the gaps in their knowledge. So the challenge is the more industrial the process, and by industrial I mean reliance on human managed inputs and outputs, the more accurate the audit is. So if we have a shed that has heifers that go into it, joining a dairy herd, and they are fed a very prescriptive ration, and we know exactly what's in that ration because we've harvested it from somewhere, we've processed it, we're then giving it to the animal. We feed those animals, they are then producing, they give birth to a calf, they produce milk, we know exactly how much milk is being produced, we know exactly the weight of that calf, we know where that calf goes, it's going off farm somewhere else to be reared. We've got a very, very simplified process, and the more simple, the more industrialized that process is, the more accurate the audit is. I'm not saying here is that industrial farming is one thing or not. This isn't about defining industrial farming. What I'm saying is that an industrial process that relies on human managed inputs and outputs, the more leads to a much more accurate audit. There's two reasons for that. One is that the audit is easy to quantify. You know exactly what's going in, you know exactly what's happening in the middle, and you know exactly what's going out. The other thing is that these systems are really easy to research because of their simplicity. And as such, we have huge amounts of data available for them. So all of these carbon audits tap into spreadsheets full of data that have been approved by IPCC, that have gone through a particular process to be included as a data set. And so they're able to draw upon those to give an assumption about what's happening on your farm. But we really have massive gaps in our knowledge about more agroecological or regenerative and even organic systems. We just don't have enough data available. So often what happens is assumptions are made. They'll take a system and then they'll just adjust it by a particular factor, or they'll tweak it. And I've got an example of that in a second, which I'm going to come to, which can show just how problematic this can be. The greater the reliance on natural processes and systems, so particularly if we're thinking about pasture for life farms that are totally reliant on the forage that we can grow, the audit will be much less representative of the system. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's just a caveat that if you've got a cow standing under a crabapple tree eating that, we're not really able to account for that when we are putting in our forage assessments, because the forage assessments really do rely on very kind of simplified approaches to sward diversity, for example. And it might say, oh, you've got diverse pasture, but you don't really have the opportunity to talk about what's in that, how, they'll ask for kind of legume content, but it's all a bit kind of finger in the air because they're not able to have that clarity. I'm going to quickly crack on so that Jock can get to have the opportunity to share some of his input as well. But just a very quick overview of the tools. So the main tools that you've probably heard of are AgriCalc, Cool Farm Tool, and the Farm Carbon Toolkit. Those three have now signed a memorandum of understanding so that they are harmonizing to some extent, because what happened was quite a few researchers put the same data sets into all three and got wildly different outcomes. And I know a number of farmers who have done that same thing. So they've put the same information into three different tools and got three different outcomes. In addition, I'd say the other two big ones that are really kind of up there in the marketplace is Map of Ag, which I really rate because it's very good. It has a particular part of its tool that looks only at animal, like the herd or the flock efficiency. And so it's not looking at like the whole system carbon audit. They do offer that, but you can really use it to hone in on the efficiency of the livestock. And it's particularly for low input systems. If you're really focusing on it in your suckler herd on things like fertility, calving at 2, and also thinking about longevity, it gives you a really good readout in terms of the carbon efficiency of your breeding herd, for example. And then Trinity AgTech also uses carbon audits, and they particularly help support linking that through to private investment and opportunities for kind of investment from external sources. So those are all farm carbon audit tools. There are hundreds out there, but these are the main ones. And then in addition to that, there's something called AgriCarbon, which is a Scottish, I think they're based in Dundee, Scottish-based business that actually go out and measure actual soil carbon. And so What's important to say here is that all of those audit tools, there's no one actually doing any measuring of any actual emissions, and there's no one doing any measuring of actual soil carbon or carbon in pasture or in meat or anything like that. That everything, all of these tools are based on assumptions from data sets that have been approved historically. So if you actually want to go out and measure something on your farm, then doing your soil sampling or getting agricarbon to come out and do that soil carbon assessment is really key. And you can plug that information into your carbon audit, but the carbon audit won't do it for you. You have to go and actually do that measuring if you want that information. Now, I just want to touch on where that point I talked about the assumptions that are made. So this is my carbon audit from 2024. No, sorry, I did it at the beginning of 24 for 2023. And so this is just looking at beef, a particular part of our herd. So one of our groups of animals on a particular land area. And what I want to draw your attention to is this green chunk here. So this says that, I'm just going to go back one so you can see the pie chart. It says that 69, so 70%-ish of our emissions come from methane. It says that nitrous oxide is about 25%, so it's a quarter, and the rest is energy use, and that comes from fuel. And I'll talk about why that's so high in a second. But essentially, it's saying 25% is from nitrous oxide, and I thought, well, this can't be right. Why is that? And if you look across to the right, it says that what we have is quite a high manure management issue. So we've got our enteric fermentation, and then this nitrous oxide comes from manure management. Now, some of you know our system, and it's outwintered cattle. They're out all year round on permanent pasture. I don't manage any manure really in my system. Everything that comes out of an animal goes straight onto the ground and decomposes where it hits the ground. There is no manure management as such within the system other than natural cycles. So I went and spoke to AgriCalc and I said, I don't understand what this means. Why is that here? And they went through the data and they couldn't understand it and they didn't know what was happening. And then what they said was, oh, well, it's because you're out wintering. And I said, right, well, why is that? And they said, well, because this is what outwintering looks like. And essentially, they didn't use this image, but this is what they described. And I have to say, I don't know, this is a Creative Commons open use license image. I don't know where it came from. But they basically make an assumption that if you're out wintering, this is what your system looks like. And you can all imagine that mix of slurry, essentially, that is produced in where those animals are standing, there's going to be real issues around nitrous oxide. This is what our outwintering looks like in reality. So the reality of our farm, and this was the little group of animals I was talking about that went through this assessment. So the reality of our farm compared to the assumptions that are made for low input agroecological farms particularly is really disparate. And so there's a real challenge there. So what we have to do when we undertake these assessments is recognise that. We can't necessarily change it just now. Work is happening to do that. And we've actually got some funding to kind of work with AgriCalc to take that forward. But we have to recognise that there are limitations. And so these tools are just a tool. They're an indicator. They don't give us all of the answers, or they don't actually even give us truth or reality. They just give us an indication of what's happening on our farm. So you might ask, well, what's the point? What are the benefits? Well, first of all, if you're in Scotland, it forms part of the whole farm plan. So if you have entitlements and you want to claim for your BPS payments, then you need to do a carbon audit as part of your whole farm plan. I would also say it's a very useful tool as part of wider business planning and reflection, and hopefully Jock's going to touch on that. We also know that supply chains are increasingly asking for this information, so they will want to see what your carbon audit outcomes are. And what I would say is that the more information available to us as farmers, the better decisions we can make, even if we have to caveat that information with well, it might not be that accurate, or it might be, not quite what we were expecting. The more data points that we can look at, the more we have confidence to make better decisions, but also to understand what's changing in our businesses. And what I also say is the more people that are engaging, the better the data insights are going to be available to these audit companies. So companies like AgriCalc, the more people that undertake these assessments, then the more information they're going to have to be able to start thinking differently about how they're interpreting that. And finally, what I would say is just in terms of top tips, I would say if you're going to go and do a carbon audit, and I would really recommend that you do, always use the same audit tool. So whichever one you choose, whether it's AgriCalc, Farm Carbon Toolkit, Cool Farm Tool, the two I would probably recommend for use in the UK are Farm Carbon Toolkit and AgriCalc. Personally, I use AgriCalc, but it's up to you which one you want to use. but just use the same one. Don't swap between them. Consistency is key, because this is your information for your business. And if you're swapping between them, you're not going to have that benefit. I would also really recommend that you undertake soil carbon testing. And if you're doing that, that you stick with the same methodology. So DUMAS is a much better assessment than loss on ignition, but many people have already started doing loss on ignition testing. Again, like with the audit tool, stick with what you've already started doing. So if you're already doing loss on ignition, stick with loss on ignition. And I can talk a bit more about the detail of those if you want, but I won't get bogged down in that now. And the other thing I would say is determine your boundary and stick to it. So I mentioned earlier that our fuel use was quite high for the size of farm or the operation. And that's because I also included our fuel use from the farm gate to the abattoir or to the butcher. And actually, I didn't include any other post-farm gate aspects to our audit. So our audit was totally up to the farm gate. And then because I just made, it was just an error that I made. I just was like, oh, well, yeah, that's part of the business. And I didn't separate out production system and direct sales business fully in terms of fuel. So I would say just be really, really clear, because this is how LCAs work. You draw a boundary around your system. And what I would say is that you really need to stick to it. Even if you're direct selling, make sure your boundary just goes to the point at which the animal leaves the farm. Don't kind of get bogged down in, oh, but then, then I've got the meat coming back and then I'm doing it, because that butchery part, or that second part of the farm, of the kind of business, if you like, could actually have its own LCA, and it's not a farm carbon assessment. It's a production or processing kind of aspect. So those would be my top tips. I'm going to stop there with any questions, and I'm also just going to close this because I can't see any of you and I feel like I'm talking to the void. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions there if there are any. Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Jock, who will have some really interesting things to say.
Nikki, can you just run us really quickly through the costs of, is AgriCalc free? Do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? Just the real basics.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, there is still funding for carbon audit. So that's the first thing I would say. And this is the last year of PSF, so preparing for sustainable farming. And you can claim for a carbon audit through PSF currently. And I think it's still £500. I don't know. So FAS as well, the Farming Advisory Service, have also been giving payments for doing carbon audits. You can't claim for both. You have to choose which one. It's not clear yet whether the FAS payment and support for carbon audits will continue or not. So we know that preparing for sustainable farming payments come to an end this year. And the FAS ones, we don't know. There hasn't been an announcement yet about that part of the budget in terms of knowledge exchange and the Farming Advisory Service. So it may well be that that continues, because that already was there. So that, and the reason I'm talking about that is because that has driven the price to some extent, in that you get £500. And so if you go to a consultant and say, hello, I'd like a carbon audit, surprise, surprise, it costs £500. So you can do all of this yourself. You don't have to get a consultant unless you want to use it, unless you're claiming the funding. If you're claiming the funding, you do have to get a consultant who's FBAS approved, which is the Farm Business Advisory something. I can never remember. It's lots of A's and lots of S's, but FAS has a list of who they are. And so if you want to claim the funding, you do have to have a consultant say, and here's my guidance for what you should do on your farm as a result of your audit. For your whole farm plan, you don't have to get a consultant to do that. So if you just want to do your whole farm plan, all you need to do is to complete a carbon audit. You don't have to get it sort of signed off or approved by a consultant. So in terms of the costs, if you want to go and do it yourself, the Farm Carbon Toolkit is free. And you can fill that in. And actually at Pasture for Life, if you are a member, we do have some capacity to help you with that, again, which is for free. And then if you want to get it signed off, we have a consultant that's a member consultant who's been working with us, who will do that signing off at a discounted rate, recognising that you've done most of the work because you've done the audit yourself. And he will do just the sign off and the kind of a meeting and a discussion with you to do that, to kind of, to kind of get that sign off bit, and then you can claim that way. So that is one option that we've been supporting. But yeah, Farm Carbon Toolkit is free to complete. AgriCalc, there's a kind of, you can do it for free, but if you want to download anything, you have to pay. And the more you pay, the more functionality you get. So they've been bringing different modules in. It's not expensive. I don't know, it's like 30 quid or something. That might have changed. But yeah, I mean, it's it really isn't an expensive thing to do for your business. And given that it unlocks the whole farm plan, you know, it's one of the keys to unlock the whole farm plan, then you might as well just pay for it and do it. And I would say that actually with AgriCalc, it's all moved to the cloud. So rather than having kind of clunky spreadsheets and things to fill in, they have been trying to make it a bit more intuitive and a bit easier to access and make some of the reporting a bit more intuitive. So I definitely think that there is a benefit. Just to say, AgriCalc was born out of SAC, SRUC combined. It's now a standalone company. They do still work very closely with SAC and SRUC, but yeah, they are an independent limited company now. So the cost, you know, it's up to you. It's not massively expensive. And I would say that with the soil carbon testing, you do get part of that covered as part of your soil testing, again, through preparing for sustainable farming. This is the last year of that. And there are various other schemes where you can get your whole farm agri-carbon assessed if you're interested in kind of moving into looking at soil carbon markets. So there are various things that you could do for that. And I'm happy to talk about those separately, maybe later if we have time. I'm going to come to Celine quickly for a question.
Yeah, so quickly on the AgriCalc and Pasture for Life work, can you tell us anything about this, Nikki? Or
yeah, so basically it kind of came up, well, it came out of me having a bit of a rant at this chief exec of AgriCalc at Groundswell, sort of saying, you know, 12:45, this is not good enough. It's not reflecting agroecological systems. And that came, we then had some really good conversations. I've met with their team, with Rachel, who is kind of their, yeah, she's the brains behind a lot of it. Her and Thomas together kind of do huge amounts of work to make all of the underpinning data and the assessments make sense. They're really open to understanding better how to make the tool work for farmers from all sorts of different systems. Again, the issue is just they don't have the data. So what we work very closely with Reading University, doing quite a lot of LCA work. So what we're now doing is making sure that any of those information or any of those papers that we're authoring, they're going straight, you know, straight sending those to AgriCalc, so they've got a heads up, so that they're aware. We also have been just received funding for a KTP, a knowledge transfer partnership between Pasture for Life and Reading, and AgriCalc has signed up as supporting that. And that will actually include our KTP research associates spending some time at AgriCalc to see how we can deliver better, more holistic sustainability assessments. And almost what we've all talked about is, wouldn't it be great if when you do your AgriCalc assessment, you can tick a box that says, I'm Pasture for Life or I'm agroecological? Because you can tick a box that says you're organic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are necessarily kind of using it doesn't automatically make you agroecological or that kind of regenerative. You know, these things are slightly different. And so it's about what are the mechanisms that we, or the indicators or characteristics that we could say, I'm agroecological because I'm X, Y, or Z. And then that potentially could slightly tweak the data in a different way to give you a more accurate readout, so that your outwintered cattle on, you know, decent permanent pasture and not being treated as if they were standing in their own slurry pit for 6 months of the year. So those are the sorts of things that we're trying to work with them. What can we do enough of from the farm end to help them tweak the data, so that if we don't have the data available, how can we tweak the assumptions that are made because of the farm typology or characteristics?
Any magical extra bits of money to go all the way to advice and training people how to, you know, because if you guys kind of like develop this, would be absolutely fantastic. I'm guessing then any consultant who then look at this will also going to need that knowledge to kind of change because just now, like some of the advice that we're hearing back from the consultant at the back of a carbon audit is maybe like, you know, more cows, intensify to reduce the overhead or stuff like that. That is like, for some farmers, so it goes against the entire plan. Yeah. So
okay, and that's fantastic. Because the output, and sorry, I probably should have said this, the output is emissions per kilo of output. And it's an intensity. It's not a true footprint. It's not actually about what your emissions are. It's about your emissions in terms of the functional unit, and the functional unit is the kilos. And none of us eat meat because of how much it weighs. well, maybe we do, but we don't go, oh, I'm going to have that steak because it's 200 grams, unless you're on like a very prescriptive diet. You're going to say, I want that because it tastes nice. It comes from a farm that I'm interested in, or I just like it. Culturally, it's relevant, and I fancy steak tonight. So actually, using weight as a functional unit doesn't really make sense. And when we do LCAs where we take nutritional quality as a functional unit or alternative land use as a functional unit, we get very, very different outcomes. And so I think, again, it's that, just raising awareness of that and helping people to understand that this isn't the be all and end all. Unfortunately, many policymakers are doing that. But thankfully, organisations like Sustainable Food Trust, using the Global Farm Metric, which was born out of something called the Public Goods Tool, which was developed in recognition that LCAs are too simplistic, is helping to change that. And we are seeing policy slowly starting to recognise the importance of that. I'm really conscious of time. So, Annie, I'm going to take your question, and I really want to hand over to Jock. Oh, you're on mute, Annie.
Yeah. If this is too difficult a question for the time, we can park it. But we had a carbon audit done a year or two ago. Didn't have our own livestock on the land, but we did have our neighbours grazing it for 3 months. And as far as we can tell, they weren't included in the carbon audit. And that just seemed a bit. So when you got our results back, it looks like we're sequestering carbon for Scotland. But actually, we know there were some cows there emitting methane for a while. So how does that work?
Don't knock it, Annie. You just hold on to that. You keep hold of that. So there's a nice example, actually. So, for example, there was a period of time we grazed some of Jock's cattle for a little while, for a few months over one winter. Now, if Jock and I had both been switched on and we knew that we were going to do a carbon audit together at that, and we were both looking at the same period, we should have had a conversation where I said, right, I'm going to take those numbers for those months, and you're going to remove those numbers for those months. And you can do that through the audit. So you can do it yourself, because it says what's your average number of livestock, and you should put every month in. So you can do that. The ideal is where you work with the farm that you're taking them from or that you're sending them to, so that if you put those two audits together, you would get a true reflection of both of the whole system that both farms are involved in. But most people don't do that. So that's why they do ask you, like, what's the average? And you're sort of meant to put in each month whether they're there or not. And they probably would have just thought that it was such a low number that it kind of came back as negligible, I would have imagined. I'm going to hand over to Jock at this point, because I really want us to have the opportunity to hear from his learnings of undertaking the audit. So Jock, over to you.
Thank you, Nikki. Afternoon, everyone. Before it goes out of my single brain cell that I have, just in response to a couple of those questions, I think it's really important that we don't look at absolute numbers in carbon audits. We should be looking at these things over a period of time. So taking a carbon audit and then looking at it in comparison in, say, 5 years' time. And that's what I'm going to do this afternoon. The other thing is, never look at a carbon audit in isolation. One of the things, speaking to a bunch of sheep farmers yesterday about this, for me, now my thinking has changed on this, but for me now, a carbon audit goes hand in hand with biodiversity. We cannot achieve one without the other. So that would just be two things I would say. Right, I'm going to see if I can battle with technology here. I've done that wrong. Let's try again. How is anybody seeing me? Is anybody seeing the remnants of a presentation there?
Yeah, but we're seeing
we
not in presentation mode.
Now you should be seeing it in presentation mode.
We are perfect.
Awesome. Right. Just very quickly, a bit about me and what we do here. So my name's Jock Gibson. I farm up at Edinvale Farm in partnership with my wife Fiona, and we are a Pasture for Life certified farm. We're running about 250 head of cattle, Highland and Shorthorn genetics, over just shy of about 600 acres, and that's a mixture of owned, tenanted, annual leases, and we've now just recently got ourselves into a bit of conservation grazing, thanks to Nikki. Everything from there is fattened for our butcher's shop, Macbeth's in Forres, And that's primarily a food service business. And we've got about 50 active food service customers at the moment. We have a retail shop in Forres, and then a mail order service supplying about 2,000 households a year. And that would be active customers. Some of them might order once a year, some of them might order once a week. So that's what we're at with that. And then we also do a bit of private processing for people as well. So helping people get their product direct to market, just using us as a butchery service. And that's a service that I'm really proud that we offer. But what it does mean is that through that, we are at the sharp end of consumer opinions and what their wants and needs are. I say wants and needs. I sometimes think the consumer doesn't know what they want or need, but what worries them is a number of things, and or they can certainly be inspired to worry about things because there's lots of propaganda floating about. So top of that list is climate change, biodiversity loss is there. They are worried about animal welfare. They want a natural and healthy food, and they want to be able to afford it. And so basically what people, and that where we've driven people, is they're looking for a guilt-free eating experience. What worries me with all of this is, and I've just had the privilege of traveling to lots of places around the world looking at their production methods, and what worries me is we are in risk of losing a competitive edge in this country with what we produce. I think, you know, looking at Pasture for Life, we have the opportunity to elevate our product. But if we look at it as an industry as whole, we are very much going down the commodity route, competing with other countries producing at a commodity product as well. And what that means is we compete on price, which generally then becomes a race to the bottom. I am very keen on making decisions and choices while they're still mine to make. And you know, for example, we've been carbon auditing since the beef efficiency scheme. Those heady days when we had schemes out there to help try and improve the industry. So we, I like to have control of what we're doing, and I want to be farming for us rather than somebody else. And you know, if we head down this commodity route, we end up farming for multiple retailers or processors who make the decisions as to what we do. And all in all, that just comes together in a lack of farming resilience. And here, our biggest threat is that we are not resilient to what is thrown at us. I guess as well, you know, I look at it as to what is the value add as to what we can offer to the consumer and why we should give one. Well, this is why we need to give a value add, because we have some of the most expensive cattle prices in the world. Well, the most expensive cattle price in the world, and some of the most expensive lamb prices in the world. And this is what our competition is doing. You know, for me, this is a masterclass in consumer reassurance and marketing. This is a product I picked up in New Zealand last year, and it tells everything the consumer needs to know so that they can have that guilt-free eating experience. You know, where it's come from, what's in the packet. It's going to be good for them. It's been looked after, and they have a certified net carbon zero scheme. And it's got an eating quality assurance scheme on it as well. And on the back, we have a carbon footprint. We have information about biodiversity, how to cook the product. And when I picked this up, I put it up on Twitter and I said, right, UK farmers, what about putting carbon footprint data onto the packet? And I got lambasted with comments such as, carbon audits don't mean anything, the consumer doesn't understand it, farmers don't understand it, it's only as good as the data you put into it. And my response to that was, well, what happens if this product ends up on a supermarket shelf next to our product when our product looks like this? So I think there's an element that we have to engage with all of this, just A, so that we can improve our own product, but B, so that we can be competitive both within our internal market and also with what is coming from our international colleagues. So I'm going to do a quick run through some of our carbon audit, and we'll be comparing where we were at the end of October 2019, which I think was the third year of our beef efficiency scheme, and the last carbon audit that we did for the year end 2023. So we did that. Well, we get our carbon audit. I used to do them myself. We now get them done by SAC. We are one of the farms that submits data for their enterprise costings that get published every year. So we give them all our financial data, and they do the costings, and they also spit out a carbon report for us. So I don't have an option to twiddle the figures. It is what it is. But internally, we have made a commitment to achieve net zero by 2030, or at least understand how close we can get to it. And we've had that commitment for a while, but we've maybe fine-tuned the dates and the caveats within it. And a lot of that is around some of the things that Nikki has said, but also how the carbon audit process has been tweaked and how some of the data is interpreted as well. So these are our headline figures. The top half of this page is our most recent carbon audit, and then the one below is where we were at the end of 2019. So so that was our carbon audit total emissions at the end of 2019, and that's where we are now. We are mostly a beef enterprise. We have some sheep. We did have some sheep. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to look at our beef enterprise. One of the reasons I'm comparing it to a carbon audit six years ago is there's a few figures in here which have changed quite dramatically, and our first one is around fertilizer. We have made, on the back of doing carbon audits, we have made a conscious decision to cut out fertilizer, and it is really because of our carbon dioxide outputs. I guess the philosophy behind this is there's some things that we can control, and there's some things that we can't. I can't control how much a cattle beast ruminates, how much it farts and burps, and how much methane it emits. I can control how long it's on the farm for, but in terms of its actual raw emissions, there's not much I can do about that. And it's part of a natural cycle, as Nikki's explained. So it's, again, it's not so high on my worry list, but direct and indirect carbon dioxide outputs, which I do have a control over, do concern me. And this particular page where we're looking at the indirect carbon dioxide, particularly looking at fertilizer use, we have a massive number there for fertilizer, looking down at the end of 2019, and as a proportion of our total emissions for cut CO2, it's really, really high. It's about 2/3 there. So, and I guess the other thing as well, this is in measurements of carbon dioxide equivalent. We may as well stick a great big pound sign in front of that. And it really opened my eyes to question what value we were deriving from that bill, both that carbon bill and that financial bill. And this is where we've cut it down to today. And actually, I don't even know why it's that high. I'm guessing, yeah, I don't even know why it's that high, because, you know, we've got a line figure in here. So, and then I guess the other thing as well is having a look at feed and energy and carcass disposal. Whilst the carcass disposal numbers are relatively small in terms of carbon, it is a measure of it can be a warning signal as to whether some things are just going wrong. For us, our herd has increased in size, so we would expect this number to increase slightly, and where we go from there. Likewise, energy and things like that, as we've got bigger and covering more area, then energy bills go up. So, and again, we see that this is our direct, so this is our fuel use. And what's slightly unfortunate with this is, you know, we've seen a massive increase in our fuel use, but what has happened in here is we have a contracting business, or we had a contracting business. We're in the process of shutting that down, and that's been lumped into here as into the beef group. So, and I guess that's one of the keys to this is when you have big numbers that aren't going the way you think they should, trying to understand a bit about what's behind that. But as I say, I find these really useful just to make some fairly key strategic decisions over some of the things that we can control. Methane, again, is an interesting one. We have very little control over it, as I've said, and as we put more numbers, we would expect that those numbers to increase. Why I get less excited about it now is because of the difference between GWP 100 and GWP star. So as I understand it, GWP 100 is the internationally agreed unit of measurements that we use to make decisions, and what derives the conclusion that we need less cows. And yet, if we look at the difference in the outputs between GWP 100 and GWP star, it is a huge, huge difference. You know, I suspect I'm talking to people here that know a lot more about this than me, but my understanding is GWP star takes into account much more accurately the life cycle of some of these gases that we look at. And in particular in methane, that's really important as it is a relatively short lifetime gas. The bottom figures, we can see we're actually in negative figures, so we were helping cool the climate. But, and it reinforces the argument, we had a period of herd consolidation over that time, so we were reducing numbers, whereas in the latest figures we were increasing them, but we're still a fraction of where we're at for what we have to report in terms of methane. Nitrous oxide, again, I don't get too excited about, purely because of some of the stuff that Nikki said. I used to get quite excited about it because of the fertilizer part of it. But you know, now that we have pretty much cut that out, we do house animals, so you know, there maybe is an opportunity for us in how we manage our manure. But at the moment, I think we have other opportunities to improve what we do. Crop residues, again, that has driven a decision to try and reduce the amount of tillage that we're doing, the amount of turning over of the ground that we do. We no longer grow any arable crops. We no longer grow any forage crops. So, and again, that's a carbon issue, but it's also a biodiversity issue as well. I wasn't, and an animal health issue as well, actually, an animal welfare issue. So it took me a while to come around to those sort of conclusions, but we've now made those decisions. And then I guess looking at the carbon stock changes. So at the moment, this is really the only bit of sequestration that's measured within carbon audits in AgriCalc. We use AgriCalc because it's what SAC use. It's what the government are really using for all the comparisons, and it's just an easy thing for us to slot into. So again, we have, because of some of this data, we have gone through the process of creating more woodland plantations, improving hedgerow management. And for me, if we can sequester the carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels, then I feel that is that's a worthwhile thing to do. And at the moment, we, according to the data, we are sequestering slightly more than what we're burning up in fossil fuels. So I feel that we're trying to do our bit to address that. How do we use this data? Otherwise, I mean, yes, we use it to do on-farm decisions, but we also use it for communication to our customers as well. One of the commitments we make is to communicate, what we're doing, trying to be very open with what we do. So this is something that we produced quite recently. I'd probably seen something on social media that made me quite cross, so produced this as a result, and to try and get that across to our customers. And then I guess this is some of the changes and some of the things that we're now doing. So that bottom middle picture where we've got cattle and forage crops. I grew up on this farm shifting electric fences for Dad. Dad was a very early adopter of forage crops and outwintering cattle at a time when it's very unfashionable to do it. And 40 years later, we were still doing it because of the carbon audits, looking at the biodiversity and actually looking at it through a consumer lens, whether it's the right thing to do. We've moved more to bale grazing. We're looking at how we graze a lot more, maybe using taller covers, or not so worried about burning diesel to get to top grass to get to nice residuals, using deferred grazing and rough grazing a lot more. And where we're having to use plastics and things like that, in the past we have played with different options. So you see the kids sitting on the clear plastic bales there, and that is where we've tried to do a better thing. I mean, the right thing would be to stop using plastic, but we're not there yet. So trying to use the best options that are out there. So where does that leave us in terms of our net zero commitment? I am doubtful we will get to it, but I would like to understand it. I feel what's missing is the carbon sequestration. The modelling is not there yet for, as I understand it, for pasture-based systems, our grasslands, how much carbon, if any, we are sequestering. What we're trying to do as part of that is engage with industry. So we're lucky enough to be on the AHDB and QMS environmental baselining project. So we've had AgriCarbon come over our ground and drill cores all over the place, which will go off and get analysed. I think out of the 170 farms, we're one of 2 farms that has not yet had our LiDAR scanning, but that will happen at the end of this year, I think. where an aeroplane will fly over us and assess the carbon stocks that way. So trying to improve what we do here and trying to use that data. I'm very addicted to data, and I think we need to be collecting that data, whether it's looking at carbon audits, biodiversity audits, but also animal health checkpoints, whether that's weight gains, whether that's whatever it might be, worm counts, and trying to build it together in one big picture. So yeah, I think that's all I've got for the moment. So I'm going to switch this off, and hopefully then we can go from there, see what anybody's got to say.
Thanks, Jock. That was really good. I'm really conscious that we're at 3 o'clock, but if you're okay to hang on, maybe we can do some questions.
Yeah, I did try and rattle through that because I appreciate
it's my fault, I think.
To do, so.
No, it's me that took ages.
Whistle stop tour.
Charlie.
Yeah, Jock, I'm really interested that your fertilizer, you've basically gone down to 0. First one, are you going organic? And if not, why not? Just out of interest. And B, maybe for Nikki, if you going organic, does that sort of automatically, we have just gone organic for what it's worth. Does that generally mean that our carbon per kilo or carbon per whatever it is likely to be low, and the models kind of work for on organic? So Jock, have you gone organic?
Yeah.
Are you gonna?
We're looking at it. Our challenge is that we have quite a lot of seasonal grazing ground. So I have to convince the landowner that they are wanting to do that. And as mentioned, we've just taken on a bit of ground, which is for conservation grazing, which is part of a much bigger estate, much bigger catchment area, bit of project work that they're doing. And that, the horrid feeling, could be the sticking point. But we'll need to have those conversations. If we can, we will. I'll be brutally honest. I'm doing it for a convergence payment because we cannot sell. We could sell store animals organically, but I can't put them through the butcher shop organically because we haven't got a slaughterhouse that will do that. In terms of the second point, I'm just going to nick it in front of Nikki. I don't necessarily think cutting out fertilizer would automatically say that you're going to be reducing your carbon audit results, carbon emissions, because it depends on so much more of what you're doing. So, and it might short term, longer term, you might decide you want to throw down lime, or you might need to do a bit more cultivation. There's loads of other things in there at play. Our elimination of fertilizer also coincided with when it jumped to £1,000 a ton.
Yeah.
So and it was a direction we were heading in. But sometimes you make decisions and there's knock-on effects to that. Yeah.
I would just add that you may have heard a very particular anti-livestock focused journalist talking about how grass-fed organic cattle are the worst for the planet. And the reason for that is because the assumptions that are made through LCAs and through carbon audits is that these animals take longer. You have fewer of them, and they take longer to finish. And as such, their emissions are much higher. So the idea, and that also is down to the functional unit being weight, right? That we are only measuring carbon emissions in relation to how much product we're producing. Those two things are underpinned by incomplete data sets that are essentially based on an assumption predominantly around biomass availability through set stocked grazing. So they go, this is how much grass you've got, therefore this is how many animals it can maintain for a year. And what they don't have any data for are changes around grazing management, which might mean that you actually can graze, create rest, create recovery, regraze. And so you get, we know that from research done at Rothamsted, we can double carrying capacity in some settings by implementing these changed grazing management systems. So there's an assumption in these organic systems that you're going to have fewer animals, they take longer to finish. The longer to finish bit, maybe we're not finishing them to the same standard or spec, but we are managing to finish off 100% pasture, some animals as around 18 months. And we know that there are other Pasture for Life certified farms doing the same. Others will take them 3 to 5 years old. And if that's what they want to do, fair play to them. But the assumptions are that they would almost always be over 30 months in these sort of systems, unless they're being finished on grain. So the assumption, again, it comes back to this thing about you've got a data set. That data set only represents some of the farm systems. And so then those data are tweaked based on particular assumptions related to models that are only ever a model, they're not truth or reality. And so actually what happens is that though your fertilizer use may significantly drop, and you're going to have increased clover in your swards or other legumes, for example, which is going to improve your carbon situation in terms of your ability to cycle nutrients better and your reduced requirement, you might see an assumption that means that your cattle, because they're organic and potentially grass-fed, that they're going to be greater emitters because there's an assumption that you're going to slaughter them later. If you actually slaughter them at a younger age, you can show that in the carbon audit, and it will account for that. But a lot of the assumptions that are made are based on kind of quite conventional approaches to organic or conventional approaches to grazing management. The other thing it can't cope with is integrated land use. So if you are grazing, say you've sown an arable crop in the autumn, winter, like winter wheat, and you're then going to bring in either some sheep or some young stock to graze that in the spring, like these LCAs and systems cannot cope with that. They can't account for a field being used for multiple things during the year with multiple outputs. So quite often that kind of skews. So you might be able to think that it copes with it because you can put it into your inputs, but it will skew the data to some extent. So there's lots of things that progressive farms are testing and trialing and doing, but it doesn't always immediately reflect in your output from your audit. So that's just something, again, don't not do it, but that's just something to be aware of.
We had one with when Agricult had the carbon sequestration model. I think they've switched it off. I don't know if they've switched it back on, but we were actually emitting carbon, and we hadn't put a plan near the place. We hadn't done anything, but the model assumed we were emitting carbon because our stocking rate was too high for the ground that we had available to us. So it assumed we were overgrazing the whole time. And we were a grass check. Were a grass check when it was running, grass check farm. So we were able to send them a whole heap of grazing data to say, our farm cover was never lower than X. No point where we overgrazing, but and that's why I say it's a model, and the model change, it gets refined all the time as new data comes through. So, and we're not always, for most of us that aren't right into all the guts of it all the time, some of the assumptions change, so some of the output changes, but that's why it needs to be compared to other industry data or to past data that you've generated yourself, so that it's a direction of travel rather than looking at absolute figures.
Yeah.
And government, everybody loves absolute figures, but it's not an absolute world.
I think that's, I kind of put my top tips, but I think what you said, Jock, is about not seeing any of these as a standalone result, that this always, your first one will be, but then your first one needs to be viewed as, well, this is a starting point, and as we move it might go up or down, but actually it's about the direction of travel and where are the changes. So that's gone up, but that's come down, and like Jock said, we massively increased our numbers, so of course that number's going to go up, but this other one came down. And to really kind of go into the detail of it and understand what it is you're looking at, and again reflect that it's not truth, it's not reality, it's a reflection of a system based on the best estimations they have for the data available at that point in time. Annie, I've got 5 minutes and then I am going to have to go. But
this was just a very quick observation. I was smiling through the last conversation because I've been a livestock economist for more than 30 years. and I've done some modelling. And the one thing I've learned is that if the results you get from the model don't look right, the model's probably wrong. So go back and fix it.
Yeah, and I think that's really evident from that picture I showed you of like, this is what AgriCalc assumes my wintering system looks like. This is what my wintering system actually looks like. There are no data sets around. I mean, you know, we're doing the bale grazing field lab. We're into year 4. There is no research in the UK on bale grazing. And so when you put that into AgriCalc, it just well, I don't know what that is. Like, what do you mean? What bale grazing? What is this? Like, it makes so many assumptions because there's not enough data. There are no data. So, you know, and that's where farming really is way ahead of the research. And it's more and more challenging for us to be able to reflect the realities of our business because they're not represented. Tess, I hope this has been useful. And hopefully you'll be able to share the recording with some folk who weren't able to join today.
It's been incredibly useful. I've learned a lot, so thank you. It wasn't for me, but I've learned a lot. It's been really good. So yeah, we'll send a recording out. We'll send it out to all the participants that weren't able to make it, and we'll upload it to YouTube as well for yourself to share, Nikki. And thanks for everything, Nikki, and thanks as well, Jock, and thanks for everyone for coming along. And I'll say last as well, if anyone wants support in particular areas, any support in terms of like workshops or seminars or whatever, give us a shout if there's any particular topics that you want us to deliver anything on. And thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Take care. Bye.